You've probably seen what an atomic bomb does to a city, but what you haven't seen is the sheer horror behind the development of this weapon, which Hiroshima and Nagasaki only hinted at. The real story of nuclear weapons is far darker than you think, as you're about to hear. In December 1938, in a chemistry laboratory in Berlin, there were two scientists who accidentally discovered that you could split a uranium atom in half, which was never thought possible. Now, without going deep into physics and chemistry here, the short explanation of why this terrified physicists is that when this happens, an atom releases something, and that's energy. Each time a uranium atom splits, it releases about 1,000,000 times more energy than any chemical reaction. It releases more neutrons, which could then split more uranium atoms, which could then create a chain reaction that results in the release of so much energy that it could destroy an entire city. And this revelation, at the time when a global war was about to start, was what scared the scientists. A lot of them were Jewish and fled Nazi-controlled Germany to warn the world. If someone took this concept, scaled it up, and learned how to harness this reaction to create the bomb, it might be a problem for the entire world. Well, it turned out they were right. And because the Germans had the best chemists in the world with huge industrial capacity, plus a fresh stockpile of high-grade uranium seized from mines in occupied Czechoslovakia, the rest of the world was more than worried that they'd get to this technology before anyone else. And then, who knows what could happen. One by one, more scientists escaping Nazi Germany came out to warn the United States government. But you know who made them think seriously about this threat? Albert Einstein. Although Einstein was a pacifist his entire life, he was convinced by his fellow scientists that he should use his reputation to make people take this nuclear thing seriously. He wrote a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt that said, quote, "Extremely powerful bombs of a new type could now be built, capable of destroying entire cities." However, Einstein would spend the rest of his life regretting that he sent this letter. Germany wouldn't come remotely close to building that bomb, as their program depended on a thing called heavy water to make their reactor work, and only one factory in the entire world produced it at industrial scale. It was in German-occupied Norway, and the British and Norwegians ran a series of sabotage operations on it. Later, the Allied bombers hit it, so the factory got destroyed several times. On top of that, most high-level physicists were Jewish and had escaped the country, so the Germans never got anywhere close to having their own atomic bomb. But the United States, fearing the Germans would get the bomb before them, started a huge project to create it first. This is how the Manhattan Project began in September 1942. Over 600,000 people worked on it, most of them with no idea what they were even working on, and it cost about $2 billion in 1945 money, which works out to about $30 billion today. They built 3 entire cities from scratch. Cities that didn't appear on any map and were top secret, while anyone who asked too many questions quietly disappeared. It was so secret that even Vice President Truman didn't know about it. Only 2 weeks after he became president was he briefed on a nuclear bomb project. However, there were several spies planted inside the project who were passing information to the Soviet Union. This is how they built their first atomic bomb in 1949, which was a deliberate copy of the American design. Anyway, around 80% of all the money and manpower in this enormous project went into producing a few kilograms of 2 rare materials that this new bomb needed. Those were uranium-235 and plutonium-239. Because the hard part wasn't physics, it was gathering enough of those 2 materials, and with the knowledge at the time, this was much easier said than done. But little by little, they understood how to make a controlled nuclear chain reaction, and through trial and error, came up with the 2 different bomb designs. The first one was called a gun-type bomb, and was relatively simple. It had 2 pieces of uranium-235 which would be fired into each other through a steel tube, and when they slammed together, the chain reaction would start and the bomb would explode. This design was considered so reliable that they didn't even test it before it was dropped on Hiroshima, which you're going to hear about in a bit. Although the main reason was they couldn't afford to test it because they had so little uranium. Now, the second design was called the implosion bomb, and it was a completely different story. It used plutonium, and making it work was far more complicated. To put it simply, because of the way this plutonium works, the bomb would blow itself apart before the actual nuclear explosion had a chance to fully develop, and this would produce maybe 1/100th of its intended power. The only way around this was to compress the plutonium so that the chain reaction would fully develop. And they did this by wrapping the plutonium in 32 shaped explosive charges, each one machined to within a fraction of a millimeter and arranged around the plutonium core like the panels of a soccer ball. All 32 had to detonate at the exact same microsecond, so the force of the blast would make this whole reaction thing work right. This is called implosion. It had never been done before, and no one was certain it would actually work, which is what led to the horrific Trinity Test. Now it was spring of 1945, and both bomb designs were pretty much ready when, on May 8th, Nazi Germany surrendered. The whole reason the United States had built this entire weapons program was gone before the bombs were actually finished. But they'd already built it, so why not use it, right? Japan still hadn't surrendered, and American planners were preparing to invade the Japanese home islands later that year. And why not make American casualties lower by erasing a few cities from the map here and there? However, before the plutonium implosion design could be deployed, it first had to be tested. On July 16, 1945, at 5:29 in the morning, in a remote stretch of New Mexico desert, the plutonium bomb on top of a 100-foot steel tower was detonated. The place was about 35 miles from the nearest small town, and just the night before the test, no one had any idea what was actually going to happen, whether it was going to work at all, and how powerful the explosion might be. And most of these scientists honestly didn't expect much to happen. But when the bomb went off, the flash was visible from over 200 miles away. The shockwave broke windows in a town 50 miles away, and the fireball rose tens of thousands of feet into the sky. The yield came in somewhere between 20 and 25 kilotons, which was much more than anyone thought was even possible. The desert sand had been fused by the heat into a layer of radioactive green glass, called trinitite. The thing worked, and the scientists were both astonished and terrified by what they'd built. Now, the radiation and the test's actual effects were something the United States government tried really hard to cover up, because the desert wasn't as empty as they said it was. Tens of thousands of civilians who lived in towns and ranches around the test site, who were, by the way, not warned and not evacuated, were told that some ammo dump had accidentally exploded and that they didn't have to worry about it. But the radioactive ash from the explosion drifted across the surrounding country for days, burned the cattle, and fell into the drinking water cisterns. Kids were coming out to play with this weird snow and green glass in the desert, holding it in their hands and licking it. People were seeing strange dust on their kitchen tables and a bunch of other weird things. Then livestock died, the infant mortality rate spiked, and several generations of people were dying from cancer in the following years. But that was only the beginning. Scientists had seen the effects of this new weapon on people, and those very same scientists who had spent years helping to build the bomb were now trying to stop it from being used. Around 70 scientists signed a petition against the nuclear bombs, but they were all ignored, because the United States big heads had been quietly drawing up a list of Japanese cities where the bombs could be dropped. And with the bomb proven, they now moved fast. The uranium for the gun-type bomb, which hadn't yet been tested, was now shipped across the Pacific to a small American-held island called Tinian, where it would be assembled into the weapon called Little Boy. The plutonium for the second bomb, the one using that implosion design, was sent the same way, to be assembled into the weapon called Fat Man. Both bombs were prepared in complete secrecy, and they would be dropped by an elite American bomber unit called the 509th Composite Group. They had specially modified B-29 Super Fortress bombers that would carry the bombs to the targets, with the whole team of scientists to make sure everything was done properly. Because otherwise, it wouldn't be a really good day for anyone. Now, by this time, Japan had effectively already lost the war. Their merchant fleet had collapsed, and 6 of their larger cities had been burned down by incendiary raids that had already killed over 100,000 civilians. And now, when those planners sat down to choose targets for the atomic bomb, they actually couldn't find large Japanese cities that hadn't already been damaged by firebombing. However, Japan still hadn't surrendered, and they were preparing for a final defense of the home islands with everything they had left, pretty much bracing for one big last stand. And Operation Downfall, which would be the largest amphibious invasion in human history, was planned for November 1st, 1945. The recent battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa had shown the US how costly fighting the Japanese was going to be, so they knew just how brutal this invasion could get. So the atomic bomb was seen as justified to shorten the war and lower the number of American soldiers killed. Which brings us to how the cities that had been nuked were chosen, and the criteria are deeply disturbing. The targets had to be at least 3 miles across, so the bomb's destructive radius wouldn't be wasted. They had to have some military or war industrial value and be psychologically significant to the Japanese, so that destroying them would send a strong message. The targets had to be undamaged by the previous bombings so that the atomic bomb's effects could be measured cleanly afterward. In other words, they wanted the cities intact so they could see what the bomb would do, as no one really knew what to expect, no matter how disturbing this sounds. So these cities were put on a quote-unquote reserved area list, meaning they wouldn't be bombed in the months leading up to August. These cities were deliberately saved long enough so that the atomic bombs could be tested on them. And who were those people who decided this, who put them in charge of our lives, and what was wrong with them? These are things we as a species have to think about a bit more often. The city chosen to be hit first was Hiroshima. It had about 350,000 people. It had the headquarters of the Japanese Second General Army, which was responsible for defending the part of the country where the Americans planned to invade later that year, and a lot of other strategic and military value. So it couldn't be removed from the list. Nagasaki, on the other hand, had at first been rejected because it had an Allied prisoner of war camp. It also had hilly terrain that would limit the bomb's blast. But as you're going to hear, Nagasaki was put back on the list anyway. It was now the morning of August 6th, 1945. Tens of thousands of people were going to work or school just as usual in the city of Hiroshima. A special American B-29 bomber named Enola Gay appeared overhead that morning at high altitude. But it was assumed to be a weather observation flight, as single planes weren't usually a threat. However, at 8:15 in the morning, Little Boy, the first atomic bomb ever used in war, detonated about 1,900 feet above the Shima Surgical Clinic in central Hiroshima. First, there was a white-blue flash, followed by the blast wave. At the hypocenter, which is the spot on the ground directly below the explosion, surface temperatures reached several thousand degrees Fahrenheit, for a brief moment hotter than the surface of the sun. Within about half a mile around that spot, every human being who was exposed to that flash was essentially atomized. They were nothing more than dark patches on the surface left standing. Far from the hypocenter, wristwatches were found that had stopped at exactly 8:15, some of which are now displayed in the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum. Moving outward from the hypocenter, the next ring was the blast wave, a wave of pressure moving faster than the speed of sound, which flattened pretty much everything within about half a mile. Everything was simply blown apart, while the fires that followed turned the city's center into a single rolling firestorm. By the end of December that year, the death toll in Hiroshima would reach somewhere between 90,000 and 160,000 people, with roughly half of them killed on the first day. Around 12 American prisoners of war were in Hiroshima that day, and some of them even survived the detonation, but they all died over the following days. But for the survivors, the real horrors were yet to come. People who were just outside the inner zone and far enough to survive the initial flash and the blast wave, well, what happened to them is in many ways worse than dying instantly. They had burns and injuries so bad that I can't even put them in this video without it being simply taken down from YouTube. And I know you guys hate this, but I can't make the video just for it not to be seen by anyone, or for the channel to get a strike. Online, you can find the testimony of a then 13-year-old girl named Setsuko Nakamura, who survived the explosion and saw with her own eyes what happened to the people still alive, if you're willing to ruin your sleep tonight. Anyway, people were burned beyond recognition, and the sight was just horrifying. Anyone who could still move headed for the rivers, and many of them died there. Then, about an hour after the detonation, the black rain started falling. And this was made of the radioactive fission products from the bomb, mixed with the vaporized materials that were pulled up into the mushroom cloud. People who survived the blast now had this rain falling on them, and they drank the water having no idea that it was extremely radioactive. The black rain spread to neighborhoods miles outside Hiroshima, and well outside the official zone of exposure, poisoning thousands of people who weren't affected by the bomb's blast in any way. By nightfall on August 6th, the survivors who could still move had crawled to the outskirts of the city, while the hills surrounding Hiroshima glowed orange from the fires still burning in the ruins. Then, 3 days later, on the morning of August 9th, a second atomic bomb mission began, but the whole mission was a near disaster from start to finish. The special B-29 bomber named Bockscar lifted off from Tinian at 3:49 in the morning with a stuck fuel transfer pump, which made some 600 gallons of the plane's reserve fuel inaccessible. They then waited, circling in the air for the camera plane that was supposed to document the bombing, which couldn't be found. So they had to go without it after 40 minutes of burning fuel waiting. Then, when they were over the primary target, the city of Kokura, smoke from a big American firebombing of a nearby city the night before had obscured their view, and they couldn't see 70% of their target. They tried for another 50 minutes to get a clear visual lock on the aiming point, but then the Japanese anti-aircraft fire started getting close, and they got the word that fighters were scrambling to intercept them, plus their fuel situation was now becoming critical. So they diverted to the secondary target, the unfortunate city of Nagasaki. However, Nagasaki was covered in clouds too, but by the time Bockscar was over the city, they had only enough fuel for a single bombing run, and barely enough to make it back to base if everything went right. Through a small gap in the cloud cover, the bombardier saw a stadium in the northern part of Nagasaki, and the bomb called Fat Man was released at 11:02. Bockscar then made an emergency landing in Okinawa when it ran out of fuel. The bomb detonated about 1,600 feet above the Urakami Valley, missing the aim point by about 2 miles. And unlike Hiroshima, Nagasaki is a city of valleys and hills, so the Urakami Valley contained the blast wave, shielding part of the city from the destruction. But the part that was directly underneath the bomb, it was completely destroyed, with some 40,000 people dying on the day of the bombing. Among them are 13 Allied prisoners of war and 2,000 Korean forced laborers. By the end of the year, the number of dead would reach somewhere between 70,000 and 80,000. Now, if you think you've got bad luck, at least 165 people are officially confirmed to have survived the bombing of Hiroshima, and then moved to Nagasaki just in time for the second bomb to be dropped 3 days later. And some of them survived both atomic bombs. The Japanese actually have a name for them, Niju Hibakusha, meaning double survivors. Now, in the hours after the second bomb was dropped, everyone knew that a new kind of weapon had been used, but no one understood what they had just witnessed and what this weapon actually was. The surrender finally came 6 days after the second bomb, but amid all that political chaos, something else was happening inside the destroyed cities. Many people who had walked away from the destruction with no visible injuries at all were starting to get sick and die in mysterious ways. Within a week of the bombing, people who seemed perfectly fine at first lost their appetites. Then came high fever. Then small purple spots appeared all over their skin. Their teeth and hair started falling out, and the final stage was massive internal bleeding. The gamma rays that passed through the bodies of everyone in the area actually destroyed the immune system and the production of white blood cells, along with everything else that a human body needs to stay alive. Yet they would seem completely fine for the first few days, until the effects started to show themselves. But they were already dead from the moment they were exposed. They just didn't know it yet. The Japanese doctors trying to treat the survivors had no idea what to do, as acute radiation syndrome had been seen only in a few isolated laboratory accidents before 1945, and never even remotely close to the scale they were dealing with now. No one could grasp what was going on. It was just horror all over the place. And while all that was happening, the Americans were telling the world that there was no residual radiation in either city, and that Japanese stories were exaggerations or propaganda. Anyone trying to show the truth was shut down by strict censorship. It would take over 20 years for the world to grasp just a partial picture of the full consequences of the atomic bombs, and they went on for decades. Leukemia, tumors, and cancers, not to mention all sorts of anomalies and defects. However, after the war ended, despite those horrors the nuclear weapons created, the real race for the most powerful nuclear weapon had only begun. The Soviets used that information from their spies to make and detonate their first atomic bomb in 1949, with approximately the same yield as the Fat Man dropped on Nagasaki. Before the Soviet bomb, the United States ran several public nuclear tests in the Pacific, partly to study the weapon and partly to intimidate the Soviets. The most famous are the 2 tests on captured warships, with one bomb airdropped and the other detonated 90 feet underwater in the middle of a fleet of target ships. The target ships became so contaminated with radiation that they had to be sunk, and who knows how this affected nature and the entire planet. And if you think that we as a species might finally say, enough is enough with these evil weapons, well, think again. Because then came the so-called hydrogen bomb. The idea is that a fission bomb, the kind that destroyed those Japanese cities, would be only the trigger for a much more powerful reaction called nuclear fusion, which is the same reaction that powers the sun. The first hydrogen bomb test happened on November 1st, 1952, on a small island called Elugelab. The yield was over 10 megatons, which is some 700 times the yield of the Hiroshima bomb. The small island simply ceased to exist, and where it once was is now an underwater crater. But even this wasn't enough, and 2 years later came the first thermonuclear disaster. During a test called Castle Bravo, American scientists got their calculations a little bit wrong. Instead of yielding between 4 and 8 megatons as predicted, it actually yielded approximately 15 megatons, roughly 1,000 times more than the Hiroshima bomb. Marshall Islanders on nearby atolls were drenched in fine white radioactive ash that children played in. You already know what would happen to them. However, the largest nuclear weapon ever detonated in our history is a Soviet bomb called Tsar in 1961, above an Arctic test site. It had a yield of 50 megatons, half of what the design called for, because they thought the full 100 megaton blast would be a little too much for the test. 50 megatons is about 3,300 times more than the Hiroshima bomb. The atmospheric shockwave traveled around the Earth 3 full times, and I honestly don't even want to know what this did to our environment and health. So this arms race over who'd have the most powerful bomb came genuinely close to ending civilization on a few occasions. And like that wasn't enough, the world's major powers still have more than they'd ever need of such weapons to make the Earth one big dead rock without any life on it. But we'll see what the future brings.